Hey everybody, Stan Scott here, Foggy Bottom Line Media. It is noon and I am now live, at least I think I am. You touched something there. All right, good morning everyone. This is Stan Scott, Foggy Bottom Line Media, going live here on Patreon. And today I want to talk a little bit about foreign policy. Donald Trump has made some foreign policy moves, basically kidnapping Maduro out of Venezuela. And I want to talk a little bit about the international order and what all of these foreign policy moves Trump is making, and then how I think it could affect that. So I'm falling back a little bit on my sort of academic expertise here in international relations and IR theory and public policy. And I want to give you a little bit of a flavor for what the Topics in American Politics lecture series will be like, because I'll be discussing issues like this in a slightly more academic sort of setting. Before I do that, let me go ahead and ask you to subscribe to the YouTube channel. After I'm finished live, I'll put the recording up on YouTube. But go check us out on YouTube at Foggy Bottom Line Media. There's lots of content there now. I've got some shorts up on TikTok and Instagram, taken from the couple of live shows I did on the ICE shooting in Minneapolis, which is still a big deal. And Scott and I are going to talk a little bit more about that in our next podcast. We'll be recording that this afternoon, and that'll go live on Thursday. So keep an eye out for that. But right now I want to talk about, after you go hit the subscribe button, I'm going to talk about foreign policy and the international sort of setup, international organizations in order that the United States set up after World War II. So U.S. wins World War II. The Germans surrender in May once the Soviet Union took over in Berlin and Hitler shot himself. And then we sort of went about dividing up Europe. Pretty much, I served in Germany in the Cold War in the 80s and 90s. I remember the Berlin Wall, and I was there when it came down, which was, at the time, it seemed like a huge political victory. Now it's definitely, for the Germans, it's been a complicated process. And then in August of 1945, the U.S. dropped nuclear weapons on Nagasaki and Hiroshima and forced the Japanese surrender. I won't go into whether it was necessary to drop those bombs, but whatever happened, the Japanese surrendered soon thereafter, and the war ended. But you've got devastation all over Europe. I mean, pretty much everything from Paris in the west and Britain, London, the British Isles had been bombed for 4 or 5 years, all the way to Moscow in the east and Stalingrad and Leningrad in the east. Lots of devastation, lots of death, lots of people dying, infrastructure destroyed, railroads destroyed, buildings destroyed, churches destroyed. So there's a lot of reconstruction and redevelopment that needs to be done. And as part of that, the United States understood at the time, American leaders understood at the time, that the United States was a hegemonic power. The United States had the largest military in the world. At the time, I think we were building something like 20,000 or 30,000 tanks and aircraft and armored vehicles a month. Just ridiculous numbers of weapons. We had millions of soldiers and airmen and sailors under arms, a huge naval fleet that almost literally had taken over the oceans. You've got similar devastation in the Far East, on the Western Pacific, where Japan had been bombed. China was more or less destroyed. Southeast Asia had been devastated. So the United States wanted to set up a system because they wanted to disarm. And the United States did not want to have to maintain that wartime footing forever. So in an effort to create a system that would protect democracy and human rights and reduce conflict and capitalism, basically protect capitalism as well after World War II, and over the course of the next decades, when American leaders understood that they would no longer have the capability of winning any war against anyone, other countries would get the atomic bomb. Other countries could build huge military forces. The Chinese would certainly be capable of doing that soon. The Russians had already done that. And so we worked to create an order while we had the power to not force it on people, but to sort of put our thumb on the scale a little bit. And we created several institutions, several international institutions. I'll talk about a couple of them. And if you want to read more about this, there's several good books on this. Eikenberry's After Victory is one good one. And I'll put links to these in the show notes when I post on YouTube. After the Empire is more about the breakdown of the American order. And then Special Providence. This is about American foreign policy after the Cold War. This is Walter Russell Mead. I'm not a huge Walter Russell Mead fan, but there's a lot in here about in this book about what happened after World War II. So step one, create an international body, an organization of nations that could basically help protect security across the world. The United Nations, U.S. set it up. I think they made one sort of mistake, and that was creating the conditions where the winners in World War II, more or less, were permanent members of the Security Council. And the Security Council is sort of a super body in the United Nations. So you have United Nations General Assembly, which has representatives from all member nations, and that's most nations in the world. And then you have what they call a Security Council that has permanent members: United States, Britain, France, Soviet Union, China, and then another set of members that rotates through the Security Council. And the Security Council can vote to censure other countries. So, for example, when Iraq invaded Kuwait back in the 90s, the Security Council censured them. There's been several votes to censure Israel in the Gaza thing, in the Gaza sort of genocide. Those typically fail because one of or more of the members of the Security Council vetoes the resolution. But the Security Council does carry some weight in the sense that when parties do agree for a ceasefire and they ask for UN help sort of policing that ceasefire, then the Security Council is the UN organization that passes a resolution that says, yes, we'll send in UN troops or whatever. Now, the United Nations has created several other organizations, internal organizations. They've created committees and commissions on human rights, on feeding children, on protecting children, on children's rights, and other sort of how do we stop starvation in the world? How can we help poor countries redevelop, and those kinds of things. Okay, so this organization is sort of an umbrella organization of sorts. It does not have legislative power over really anything, including other organizations I'll talk about here in a minute. But it did actually act as a legislature after 9/11 when it passed the UN General Assembly passed legislation restricting banking for terrorist organizations and sort of forcing international banks to cough up information about terrorist organizations. So there actually has been one piece of legislation passed by the UN General Assembly that appears so far to have been more or less accepted as legitimate by member nations, by nations across the world. The U.S. helped set up other organizations, the International Monetary Fund, which helps stabilize currencies across the world. It helps to make sure one of the real problems that the Depression caused and that helped lead to World War II was runaway inflation in many countries in Europe, especially Germany. And the Nazis were able to use that in part and other issues to demonize outgroups like Jewish people, gypsies, homosexuals, Polish people, anyone that they didn't consider Aryan. And that inflation helped create the conditions for fascism to rise in Germany and in other countries more in Eastern Europe than Western Europe. But fascism wasn't completely dead in countries like Britain and France and even the US. The United States had a fascist movement prior to World War II that basically lobbied for us to stay out of the war. They would have been happy had Germany won World War II. And well, I'll talk about this in later podcasts, but it appears that this fascist strain in American life is beginning to get bigger again. And you can kind of see that with some of the stuff ICE is doing. So the International Monetary Fund was also important for stabilizing currencies to protect from this kind of inflation so that one country's currency couldn't become worthless or couldn't so easily become worthless against other currencies. And the IMF also was very critical when countries started going off the gold standard. So this helped stabilize currencies, and at the end of the day, sort of made U.S. currency, the dollar, an international currency of sorts, because everything is sort of more or less pegged to the dollar. So if you're buying oil on an international exchange, you're probably going to have to do it in dollars to get the best price, right? You can buy it in Chinese currency or rubles or German marks or euros, but if you buy in dollars, you're probably going to get the best price because there's no exchange rate involved, okay? The World Bank similarly helped to stabilize currencies, but also served as a lender to poor countries who could otherwise not get access to loans for their reconstruction and for development. So World Bank loans help pay for things like dams and water systems and electrical grids in countries that didn't have them before World War II. And in fact, internally in the U.S., the Tennessee Valley Authority was a very similar sort of organization that helped bankroll some of the infrastructure in the Tennessee River Valley in Tennessee, Kentucky, Southern Ohio, northern Alabama and Mississippi, places like that. Places that didn't have running water and indoor toilets until really the 50s and 60s. Okay. The United States was able to negotiate what they called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was a free trade agreement, a global free trade agreement. Not every country participated in this, but it did set the conditions where retaliatory tariffs were more difficult, more complicated, and the global economy could operate as one. Anyone who's taken Econ 101 understands macroeconomics sort of requires at least a little bit of specialization. No country can do everything. We can't grow pineapples in most of the US. So if you want peaches and you live in Montana, you're going to have to buy them from someone else. If you want avocados and you live in Minnesota, you're going to have to get them from somewhere else. And countries that specialized were then able to more easily trade with other countries that were specializing in something else. And then the United States created another economic organization. The US didn't create it, the Europeans created it, the European Economic Commission, and then the European Community that stabilized these countries that had been at war twice, basically in 50 years. People today don't remember that Europe was basically at war for most of the first half of the 20th century. The World War I started really early in the 1910s and didn't end until about 1920, 1918, 1920 in some parts of the Balkans. And then all that started up again in the 30s when Japan was getting expansionist in the East. Germany was starting to get expansionist in Europe, and the European countries were basically at war for about 20 to 25 out of the first 50 years of the 20th century. And Europeans especially, but everyone else, wanted to see if we could fix that. The Marshall Plan was a big help there. The United States, General Marshall lobbied for the United States to spend heavily on reconstruction in Europe, to replace the roads that had been bombed, to replace railroads, to replace airfields for the coming aviation boom that was about to happen. And the United States benefited from this. And how do you think the United States could benefit from spending all this money in Europe? Well, it created a bunch of new customers, obviously, right? So when these countries were destroyed and poor and their people were starving, they're not buying much of anything from anyone. They didn't have any money. But once we basically restarted their economic engines, then we created the conditions where they could buy from us. And because of these other agreements, this created sort of a global a free trade agreement of sorts that allowed every country to prosper as much as possible, to the extent they cooperated and joined into these organizations. Now, there are others. This is not a comprehensive list. There are other things that happened after World War II that the United States helped to put together that were really important. Things like new rules on the laws of warfare, new laws of the sea treaties that governed merchant shipping and fighting on the oceans. And all of these things were designed to protect democracy across the world and to spread democracy across the world, human freedom, spread human rights across the world, and to spread economic prosperity across the world, okay, and to spread capitalism across the world. The idea here was to protect American-style democracy and capitalism without the U.S. having to maintain a huge military force. Now, we did that anyway. We definitely sort of pulled back after World War II, but as the Soviet Union became more powerful and China became a larger potential threat, we slowly ramped up our military spending back pretty much to almost World War II levels at this point, where we're basically patrolling the world. Now, a lot of this, in some sense, can prop up these other organizations because we're not exactly the world's policemen, but we are the country that can form a police force along with other nations in the event one nation, seriously violates these understandings and norms and rules that have been put into place. The Iraqi attack on Kuwait is a great example of this, where basically NATO came to U.S. aid. Article 5 of the NATO treaty requires us, if NATO is attacked, we weren't exactly attacked in Kuwait, but a lot of NATO countries joined and other countries joined us in what they called the coalition of the willing that joined in on the basically response to Saddam Hussein. NATO did join with us under Article 5 after 9/11 to fight the global war on terrorism. So these organizations benefit us as well. This is not all just us doing things for other people, okay? So, and by the way, if you're watching, feel free to put something in the chat. I'll see if I can respond if you have any questions, okay? All right, so, and maybe this is how I'll do the lecture series. So if anyone's joining, they can join in the chat and ask questions at the time. Okay, so what's Trump up to now? Well, we know he sent military forces into Venezuela and basically kidnapped Maduro, the president of Venezuela. He actually tweeted on Truth Social the other day that he was the acting president of Venezuela. And as an aside, I think I may have been banned from Truth Social because I used some tweets of his on Truth social in a couple of the live podcasts I've done. So, and I went there this morning to see if there was anything new, and my account, as far as I can tell, no longer exists. So that's interesting. In any event, he's invaded Venezuela. He claims that the United States is running Venezuela, and to some extent that could be true. To the extent that attack and threats of future attacks has caused the Maduro regime, now that he's gone, to more closely align with Trump's demands. And these would be demands about Cuba, for example, because Venezuela's been a huge supporter of Cuba. This could be demands about oil. They may be a little more susceptible to that kind of diplomatic pressure now that they've been literally attacked. Trump has made noise about Cuba, and this is no surprise since Marco Rubio is of Cuban descent, Florida senator and now Secretary of State. And there's a lot of political pressure among the Cuban American community in Florida to basically decapitate or sort of end the communist regime in Cuba and bring democracy back to Cuba. There was really never a democracy there, not after Batista overthrew the democratically elected leftist government. And folks, this is a running theme in American history. And I'll talk about this a lot when I do the podcast on the lecture series. But this is a running theme in American history since the Monroe Doctrine, that the United States sphere of influence covers Latin and South America. And we've gotten very nervous as a country whenever a Latin or South American country elected a leader democratically that was sort of to the left and either communist or borderline communist. We have a long history of overthrowing those regimes and installing right-wing dictatorships, right-wing military dictatorships in those countries. It's happened in Panama. It's happened in Guatemala. It's happened in Colombia. It's happened all up and down from the Texas border down to the tip of Chile and Argentina. And honestly, this sort of started in the 1840s when the United States literally invaded Mexico. Went to war with Mexico largely to spread slavery, which is another topic I'll cover during the lecture series. So Cuba is falling apart. It's not a very strong nation, economically very weak, very few military forces. If they have 5 operational combat aircraft, I'd be surprised. No chance of fighting off a U.S. invasion if we actually wanted to invade. There's been scuttlebutt about Colombia, arguably using the excuse that they run drugs to the United States, that they're killing Americans with their poison. Yeah, which I guess they are in a way, but Americans' desire for that poison sort of creates the market. So, what's the solution there? Maybe it's to kill the thing on the demand side and worry less about the supply side. The war on drugs was an effort for that, didn't work. And then Greenland. And Greenland's the big one because Greenland it's an autonomous region under the protection of Denmark. And honestly, that itself is sort of a vestige of the old colonial power days, but 1700s, 1800s, when the British ruled England and Pakistan and a whole bunch of southwestern Asia. Germany had colonies in Africa. Italy had colonies in Africa. France had colonies in Africa. The U.S. became a colonial power and an imperial power pretty soon after the Civil War, really before the Civil War when they invaded Mexico. But then, the 1898 war with Spain, which gave us all kinds of colonies, including the Philippines. We kept some of the territories we captured after World War II in the Pacific. Logical to do so in some sense, but these are basically colonies. The United States is an empire, for good or ill. And I think that empire has done some good, but that empire has also done a lot of bad. And the discussion about Greenland is an interesting one, because Greenland is subject to Denmark, which is a NATO ally. And no one's ever really talked before about what happens if one NATO ally attacks another. So what happens if the United States tries to use military forces to capture Greenland? Does NATO respond? Does Britain and Germany and Poland and the Czech Republic, do they send troops to Greenland to defend it against the United States? What we're talking about here, folks, is a serious attack on the social infrastructure, the international social infrastructure that the United States helped to create after World War II, that has brought, for really 75 years, something that sort of resembles an international legal regime across the world, where states can sanction other states. They feel it, they change their behavior. States cooperate when fighting international gangs, international cartels, all under this organization, under this infrastructure, this social infrastructure that the United States created at the end of World War II. An attack on Greenland by the United States would tear that apart. It would, if nothing else, get the United States kicked out of NATO. I honestly don't think NATO would disband. And in fact, my IR theory training tells me that NATO would be more important than ever, and that NATO might, in fact, start trying to pull in other countries as a way of balancing U.S. power. Because the Europeans, Britain, France, Germany, the NATO countries, they could put up a fight against the United States in Greenland or elsewhere. Winning that fight would be a very heavy lift. They don't really have the industrial capacity, and they're not really in a good spot to shift their industrial capacity for a wartime production of tanks and aircrafts and missiles and things like that. So any attack on Greenland would carry a very heavy cost for the United States by potentially destroying this world order and creating an every country for itself situation that would bring some new alliances, to balance the United States. So we want to watch this very carefully. Trump is embarking on an imperialistic regime, which it's a very interesting policy shift, because he ran on ending forever wars like Afghanistan, and he in fact negotiated the end of that occupation. Biden had to implement it, but Trump negotiated it. And he argued that the United States shouldn't be so heavily involved in these other countries, in world affairs. We should be spending our money on us, on American veterans who are homeless, on making life affordable for Americans, right? Bringing housing costs down and grocery costs down, rent down. But instead, he's branching out into these basically imperialistic type moves. And I get the logic I think he's using is about resources, oil in Venezuela, heavy earth metals in Greenland. God knows what's under that ice sheet, right? That could be very, very valuable and profitable. So you have to ask yourself, why? Why is he doing this? And the only thing I can think of is that, like I mentioned before, I think he's part of an active coalition of very wealthy international oligarchs And I'm talking about oligarchs from Russia, oligarchs in the US, South African oligarchs like Elon Musk, British oligarchs, the super wealthy billionaires or almost billionaires who don't like to be constrained by nation states based on what voters want, right? They don't want to be constrained by nation states based on what voters want. So one thing they can do about this is break down this international order, get states to stop cooperating so much, and that helps them push whatever agenda they have. Okay, there's actually a conspiracy theory that some of these guys want Greenland because they think climate change is going to make Greenland a very cool place to live, and they basically want to occupy it, turn that into a technocracy, and then make more billions on all the stuff they'll pull out of Greenland, oil or gold or whatever the heck's under there. And the heavy earth metal thing, these very special, very rare earth metals, it's very important to understand why they care so much about that. And it's because they're so important for the computing power that they've made their bones on. So if you want to keep computers going, if you want to keep expanding compute power, if you want AI, you have to have more and more of these chips and more servers to run them, and that requires more and more of these rare earth metals. And there seems to be an infinite amount of oil in the ground. There's not, but there seems to be, because we keep getting better and better at pulling it out. But there's not an infinite amount of these rare earth metals, and that's why these billionaires care so much about it. They want control over all that stuff. Okay, so what does this all mean? It means that we have to think very carefully about what will happen if the United States and Trump, with his Don Road doctrine in the Western Hemisphere, manage somehow to destroy this international democratic, what we call the liberal order, but it's liberal only in the sense that it's based on democracy and capitalism. It's actually very conservative in the sense that it's not really super actively progressive in the sense of expanding democracy rapidly, expanding human rights rapidly. It's a lot more conservative in the sense that, at least in the sense that things should be taken very slowly. And it's hard to get states to cooperate sometimes, right? So if you can do that in some kind of umbrella of United Nations or International Monetary Fund or GATT or trade agreements, whatever, then you can increase the chances for peace and prosperity across the world. You can decrease the chances of conflict and state-to-state wars, which had all but ended until the Cold War ended, and now they're starting to come back. Iraq invades Kuwait, Russia invades Ukraine. That was very uncommon until the Cold War ended. So what all this means is that the economy we live in, the very prosperous economy Americans live under, depends very heavily on these international agreements. It depends very heavily on these international agreements. Our automobiles are inexpensive because they're assembled in Mexico. This is one reason German cars are more expensive than Japanese cars, is because most of them are made in Germany or Czechoslovakia, right? Those Skoda plants. So we run a very big risk here of completely obliterating the U.S. economy by doing this, at least for people who aren't billionaires already or about to become one. So it looks like I'm coming up on about 30 minutes here, and I'd like to keep these at about half an hour every day, but I will have more on this, and I'll cover a lot of these similar topics during in the lecture series, the American, Topics in American Government lecture series, which I'm hoping to start recording this week and get that out next week, at least the first one. So expect me to return to these themes, okay? Because this is important geopolitical stuff. Americans don't look beyond our borders very much. We tend to be inward facing a lot of the times, and we don't understand how important these things are. We take them for granted. We all grew up with them. Okay. I mean, even someone who's my age, right? All of these things were in place or coming into place by the time I was in my 20s. And so this is what we've lived with really for the last 60 years or so. And it's hard to overstate how important these are for a stable order in the world. Now, right-wingers, a lot of right-wing conspiracy theorists don't like this stuff. I've been to Tea Party meetings where they criticize the United Nations and what they called Agenda 2021, which was about human rights. And a lot of Americans are okay with protecting human rights in Nigeria, but once you start trying to protect people who don't have rights here, that's a different story. They take offense to that. They don't like the idea that their children might have rights beyond as property of the parents. A lot of people think children are their property, and they're the only ones that get to have any influence on them. And okay, fair enough, they are your children, but what about abused children and children who are starved to death as punishment, that kind of thing? So a lot of right-wing guys don't like these organizations because they consider it the beginnings of a world government. And they don't like the idea of the U.S. relinquishing any of its sovereignty to these organizations. And I'll tell you, we have done that. We have relinquished a little bit, but not very much. And they would like to, I think what part of their project is to pull back on that. The point I'd make is that the United States in the 21st century cannot go it alone. We just can't do this all by ourselves. We don't have all the stuff we need. We're making plenty of oil now, but that's a finite resource. We don't have the rare earth stuff. We don't have the chips that are made in Taiwan, right? Your iPhone that you think is too expensive at $1,200, wait till it's $12,000 because they have to make it in Detroit. And it's not because the labor's more expensive so much as it's because getting the materials there would be more expensive, because we would have to pay through the nose to get them without these kinds of agreements that sort of place guardrails around what countries can do as far as monopolizing pricing and dumping products and things like that. So I'm coming up on 40 minutes, so I'll go ahead and wind down. At the end of the day, this is about protecting a democratic liberal order across the world that has protected the U.S. and protected American interests since World War II. The United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, and other agreements like NAFTA that came out of that. We've had some problems, especially with exporting our manufacturing, but folks, that's not coming back. Manufacturing is not coming back to the U.S. It doesn't make economic sense for anyone to build a factory in Detroit. Okay, it just doesn't, unless the government builds the building for them and just hands the profits over to the private sector. That's another topic I'll get to, and how we've socialized corporate failure, but not corporate success. In any event, we need to protect this world order, and we need to protect it from Trump. But it's a right-wing regime that is attempting to dismantle this world order, either so that the United States can be isolationist and basically just take what we want, or so the United States can control everything and just tell everyone else what to do. And if you don't like it, we'll just bomb you. So it's an interesting international relations question, because they're redesigning what international politics looks like, which means that the old IR discussions about agency and structure, and what do political leaders have to do with any of this? Does a nation have agency, or only its leaders have agency, or its people, if it happens to be a democracy? Does the idea that democracies never fight, never go to war against each other, is that about to die? Is the fact that I think one of the old saws was that no two countries that both had a McDonald's have ever been at war with each other. And I wonder if that ended when Russia invaded Ukraine, because I'm pretty sure there's a McDonald's in Russia. Not sure if there was one in Ukraine 3 years ago. All right, so you can find us at foggybottomline.com. We're on YouTube at Foggy Bottom Line Media. Please go there. Check us out. We've got a bunch of content up now. There's more to come. And subscribe. Hit the subscribe button. Hit the bell so you get notifications. Give me a comment. Send me some comments. Talk to us about what you see, the stuff you'd like for us to cover. Okay, and we will get to those topics. I'll be live again tomorrow. Scott and I are going to record a podcast this afternoon. We'll probably talk about the ICE stuff. I'll be live again tomorrow. And I think tomorrow I'm going to expand upon this. And I'm going to start talking about some of these isms. You've heard me talk about fascism a lot. So I'm going to lay out just exactly what I mean by that and why I think the Trump regime more and more appears to fit those criteria. And down the road, I'll talk about communism and socialism and capitalism and all these other isms that we throw around when a lot of people don't seem to know what they're talking about. Because if you think the Democratic Party of Virginia or the Democratic Party in the United States is communist, you don't know what communism means. You don't know what that word means. You just don't. Because none of these people are communists. Now, there are some social democrats in the party, and there is a communist party, there's a social democratic party, but even that's not really communist, not in the sense people throw that word around. So I'll talk about those kinds of things. So that's it for today. I'm going to go ahead and sign off. So take care, everyone. I'll post this on YouTube. So if you're watching it later, it was recorded on January 13th at noon. I'll be back live again tomorrow on Patreon. And folks, I can go live on YouTube if I can get a few more subscribers. I think I need about 100. Once I've got 100, I can go on YouTube, and it might be easier for some of you to find us. So go on there, like, subscribe, check us out on Insta, check us out on TikTok. I've posted some shorts up there that are getting some views. We're going to keep trucking. On Thursday night, I'm going to go to a board meeting about a data center here in Hanover County, here in my space, my area. So I'll probably do a short from there, and I'll probably talk about that when I go live on Friday. So take care, everyone. Have a great afternoon. Enjoy. If you're listening, let me know what you think. If you're not, check us out on YouTube and Insta and TikTok. This is Stan Scott with Foggy Bottom Line Media, and I'm out here. Take care, everyone.